All right, guys, thanks for tuning in here. Just wanted to do a quick webinar on examining some progression and regression pathways. Most of this will be catered to strength training specifically, but I suppose we can kind of take the concepts and apply them elsewhere. So, with that, we're going to have a couple of main talking points today, but what I wanted to start with was just looking at the dynamics of coaching and at least how I perceive them. So if we're looking at coaching, really what we're looking at is something that is dynamic and persistently interactive. The communication pathways between the coach and the athlete is really going to be the driving factor for success, really bar nothing else. If we don't have an ability to, keep a finger on the pulse or maintain that relationship with the athletes that we're working with, then really everything else is for naught. I think another big point with coaching is that this is inherently malleable. We're always looking for different ways and different strategies and how to optimize different athletes depending on how they best learn or what their capabilities are. So I think it's really important for us to stay, loose with what our methods are and what we're married to. Critical thinking, problem solving, we can kind of tie these two in together. But really, this is the root of coaching. It's just being able to think on your feet and really be able to identify and then solve problems that are presented in front of you. Very little of the textbook or conventional knowledge really becomes applicable once you get so far into your career. And that point doesn't really take very long. So I think this is such an underwhelmingly practiced part of coaching. But, we really need to emphasize just sheer critical thinking and problem solving and then attach them to a lot of the foundations of being a strength coach. And then kind of tying the last two together here, two terms that I really try to latch on to when I'm putting programs together or working with my athletes. Everything we do needs to be athlete driven and solutions based. So when people ask, are you a West Side guy? Are you a functional movement guy or this or that? I'm none of them and I'm all of them at the same time. I utilize these things as concepts when they're needed, but, I'm not exclusively married to anything. Couple of preliminary points here. We want to again think about strength and performance training as this continuum. There really is, no fixed start point, end point, beyond the obvious of when you're introduced to athletes and then when you finish working with them. But really, that timeline is indefinite, and I think it's important for us to remember that we have to keep an eye on a lot of different things. And so this image here, the chaos theory, always really sticks out to me when I'm thinking about coaching because everything really does affect everything, and how we go about our ways for warm-ups will then influence how the training session is performed, and then how the training sessions are performed over time will then, of course, affect the athlete. So we're really just shifting and moving these variables around. But with that, variation doesn't necessarily equal chaos or randomized. I think that's something that's a little bit misconstrued. Yes, we need to establish foundational patterns, and yes, we need to be proficient with them before we start getting in anything sophisticated or more nuanced. But at the same time, adding different variations along the way does not make it, this chaotic program that, should be reserved exclusively for advanced athletes. The goal really remains simple. We want to challenge and then facilitate our athletes, so keeping these in mind, applications that we use for training should remain variable as well. And of course, they should be thoughtful. But the most basic way that we can look at this is just looking at a dimmer switch, right? We're doing a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that, a little bit more of this, a little less of that. It's a constant fluctuation of trying to find right where the athlete needs. And we may or may not ever reach that empirical point, but these are the perceptions that we want to have leading into it. So, we look at specificity, which again is, I think, is an overwhelmingly misused term. But we look at specificity for addressing individual differences with the athlete. So again, it's, pushing that dimmer just up a little bit or pulling it back down just a little bit to try to drive that specific response that we're looking for. On a general scale, it's very simply increasing and decreasing demand. So when something becomes too easy for somebody, we need to make it a little bit more difficult some way, somehow. Something is too challenging, again, we need to pull that dimmer switch back down. We are always in control of the modalities and the intensities that we're applying for our athletes. So we need to look at this less as a binary, we do this or we don't do that, and look at it as more of a, we're right here right now, we're trying to get to this point, but we may need to pull up, pull down a couple of times before we do. This is a really big one for me, and I think this is probably my most commonly used anecdote or metaphor, whatever you want to call it. But we want to look at creating layers in our training. And what I mean by layers is, this is a constant refinery process. We're always looking for different ways that we can add, continuity and construct to the programming, but doing it in a thoughtful way. So if we isolate the central nervous system, which is really the governor of all movement, I try to view this like a river. With that, we have depth first and foremost, and our depth is our fatigue resistance. If we get tired quick, our training is not going to be good. Second, and kind of, I guess, kind of the marquee point of these three for this presentation is our width of our river, or our ability to tolerate variability. This is a big one in my world, working with tactical athletes, because there's really no clear-cut definition as to what they need or what they need to be doing or ready for in their world. So we look at it as we really just want to increase their bandwidth or their ability to, not only tolerate, but be proficient and effective in multiple positions with multiple stimulus, with multiple loads and different parameters. Lastly, we have current, which is a little bit more simply just the speed of muscular contraction, or the rate at which we can produce movement, the rate at which we can control external stimulus and impulse. So this is going to be kind of a linchpin to the rest of the slides that are to come here. But this, I think, is a really simple way of looking at the central nervous system, which can obviously be quite a dense topic. All of these things are reliant on, again, the coach-athlete communication and trust. There has to be a two-way street. It has to be a dynamic. Nobody's trying to, or at least we shouldn't be trying to impose this, authoritarian type of presence as a coach, right? I'm here to help you. I'm here to help my athletes. And I think this is even more profound when we're working with adults, right? When we have 10, 12-year-old kids running around, some of these things may not apply quite as directly. However, when we're working with kids, 18 and up, and then, again, with the adults, really try to inquire about how they're feeling and what their input is with our training. And, again, I mentioned it, that this is just a constant refining process. There is no finish line. We are always trying to seek out better and optimal. So that brings us to kind of the base of the discussion today. My wonderful wife, Nicole, put these charts together here, these graphics here together for us to go off of today. But this is really what we're going to hone in on. And what I, wanted to try to get across with this is external load, breathing, tempos, position, and accommodating resistance are typically the most utilized metrics or modes for me. I'm sure some of you can probably plug these in a little bit differently, but nevertheless, the point being that there is a regression and a progression for all of these. And I think we tend to get a little bit too latched on to just the progression side, right? But hopefully what I can help illustrate here today is that this is a continuum. We're constantly working back and forth, and it depends on the athlete, depends on their training history, it depends on their injury status and their readiness, it depends on where we are in our training calendar and where they are in their sport year. So, there are a ton of variables at play here, and we need to remain cognizant that, it's not on and off. It's a little of this, a little of that. Where are we? How are we performing? And these are again constantly dynamic. So, really, if you take nothing else away from this presentation today, just know that progressing exercises goes well beyond adding 5 or 10 pounds, right? And equally, regressing exercises goes well beyond redacting 5 or 10 pounds, right? There's a lot more to this. So we need to consider the athlete, the individual deficits, weaknesses, and their sport and life demands, and then how these different variations or regressions can be beneficial for them. We're looking at optimizing sport performance. So this has several variables, which pure linear strength or compound strength is just one of them. So again, once we get past that foundational window, there's a lot of stuff that's at play here. And I again, something else I latch onto frequently is, don't emphasize the problems, find the solutions. There's always a solution, and it's our job to find those solutions. Starting out here with external load, obviously the most commonly practiced one, but what you should immediately take away from this is how limited this is, right? We can add weight or we can subtract weight. That's pretty much the gist of it. So if your progression regression model simply consists of adding or reducing weight, we're leaving a lot of low hanging fruit on the table, and we should really kind of reevaluate the way we're going about progressing our athletes. So you don't want to put yourself in a box. We got to figure out different ways to apply stimulus. I think if we're looking again at athletes that are 10, 12, 14, 16, even 18 years old that have a very low training history or just, are more on the novice side, then of course we're going to emphasize this most, building up to reasonable, sufficient strength or foundational strength levels before we look to add anything sophisticated on top of that. However, beyond that, I just find this to be minimally effective. Maybe outside of our main lifts, our bench, squat, dead, clean, push, press, outside of those things, I just see a very, very little return on, doing a bent row, a dumbbell RDL, and a dumbbell overhead press, for 6 weeks on end with just, 5-pound incremental load increases. I think that there's a much more efficient way and a much more pragmatic way that we can go about it. And that really just boils down to the dynamics of sport. We look at sport, and again, there's so many different variables that we have to consider. So our thinking has to go beyond just adding and reducing weight. One of the first ways that we can apply this is through breathing, right? This, I think, is probably the most underappreciated or overlooked, training variable that we look to prescribe or program. And before I get any further on this, I have to give credit to my man, Rob Wilson here. You can find him on Instagram at Prepare to Perform. Truly a phenomenal Instagram account and even better person. Rob has really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And I just can't talk about anything breathing related without giving him full credit. So I definitely encourage you guys to check his stuff out if you're looking for a true expert on breathing. But nevertheless, the four breathing modes that I really look at or incorporate on the progression side, we're looking at nasal only, some hypoxic breathing, and then most of us are familiar with the Valsalva maneuver, which is really more of a skill than a training progression. But on the regression side, and I say regression loosely with this, but belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, whatever you want to call it, and or positional breathing. This is something that we utilize heavily as a restorative method. So, even for our most advanced athletes, we're still applying a lot of positional and diaphragmatic breathing for them. Pre-session, post-session, in between training sessions, adding this into sleep hygiene, wake-up hygiene. There's a lot of benefit to this. But if we look a little bit further here at belly breathing, really what this boils down to is our parasympathetic and sympathetic balance, right? Most of our athletes are going to be heavily sympathetic driven, and it's our responsibility to teach them to be a little bit more parasympathetic when needed. If we are too far on this scale and we are not active on this scale, then we're just going to lose the ability to recover effectively. And you can be the biggest, baddest, in the world. But if you can't recover effectively, then your performance will absolutely decline. So, don't see this as some pansy thing that we're doing just to fill time with. I mean, this is, again, a learned skill. So I think it's been disproportionately, bastardized or bludgeoned over the last couple of years here, and I think we're overthinking this a little bit. Really, what we're trying to do is just look at biological equilibriums, right? Training state, resting state, both need to be accounted for, and if we can't recover well, then we cannot perform well. The diaphragm is our primary breathing muscle. Essentially, this is responsible for inflating and contracting the rib cage. This is a underneath view here, so we have the bottom of a vertebra here, or spinal column, and we see that we have some vascular structures that run through here. So there's a lot going on at the diaphragm, but for the sake of this conversation, really what we want to think about is, this balloon effect here, where these very perfectly drawn arrows are depicting. We want to think out and up. So when I'm coaching breathing, or belly breathing for that matter, I'm trying to get them to fill out into their obliques, breathe into their backside, and then expand the stomach as they take that inhale. And then again, as they exhale, I want to see the stomach collapse and the obliques start to kind of come back into the midline. So this is not just, again, down on your back and concentrate on your breathing. This is a skilled position that we want to get into and your athletes will notice it. They'll feel it right when they get it right, and you'll probably be able to see it. But what this boils down to is, again, this is our primary breathing muscle, and last time I checked, oxygen uptake is pretty important. So for our ability for our peripheral muscles or every muscle to be able to work effectively, we have to be able to get oxygen to it. On more of the progressive side here, we're looking at nasal and hypoxic breathing, and again, I am far from an expert on this, so this is just a very base level of what we have going on here. But to my understanding, nasal breathing is a good way to isolate improving heart rate variability, which we all know is extremely important. But HRV is essentially, the variance between R to R intervals or heartbeats and how much control we can have over that. So again, if we have an athlete who does not know how to recover properly or can't get back into a parasympathetic state, then that heart rate is just going to kind of be all over the place, and we're going to see a lot of variation there, which of course is something that's going to be potentially adverse in sport. When we look at hypoxic breathing, this is really looking more at the CO2 accumulation, and really being able to drive the tolerance up for CO2. And what this does is it gives us a more active ability to control heart rate and to be more efficient with our breathing. And then by default, our muscle and our physiological systems are then more efficient with that O2 and CO2 trade-off. So I tacked this on here as well, but I also think that there's something to do with the biorhythm, right? We are forcing our athletes to become more conscientious of what they're doing while they're moving, and then what those responses look like. Moving on to tempos here. Tempos are something that again are probably a little bit under practiced in my opinion. This is great for both advanced and novice athletes. And they can be used in different ways, right? So when we think about eccentric training, we all go to that West Side mentality of, 110% for an assisted, back squat overload, or we think about, heavy inverse bands that are increasing eccentric forces as we descend into the bottom of the squat or bench or whatever. But again, there's a lot more to this, right? So we can take an athlete who is brand new and still has that, baby giraffe walk, and force them to do basically everything eccentric. Just having them do body weight split squats with an eccentric load or a TRX row with an eccentric emphasis. And what this does is it slows them down to appreciate the movement control and just generally practice the movement pattern, and really start to kind of lay down good movement patterns that they can build off of. Same thing applies for isometrics, right? We can use this as a biofeedback tool to teach and introduce positions that are either uncomfortable or unfamiliar to them. On the progressive side, yeah, we have our overloads and our supermaxes with our eccentrics, but I also think that there's some lesser we'll say sexy ways to apply this that again are just great for neurological and muscular health. Isometrics, we can work as heavy positionals, or we can work them as more of just a time under tension factor. So from there, we have reactive and plyometric tempos, or just moving things faster, and then pulsing, which again is another way to kind of tap into our neurology. So if we come down here, lot of words going on here, but basically we're just looking at the way we can play with the neurology or the neuromuscular mechanics by applying tempos, eccentrics, isometrics, and really the ones that I look into or emphasize heavily on the eccentric side is the neuromuscular synchronization. So basically looking at our input and our output pathways, our afferent and our efferent, and improving our ability to desensitize the GTOs. GTOs are Golgi tendon organs, and those are our body's governors that basically try to keep us safe. The problem with the GTOs is they kick on a lot sooner than they really need to. So this again is another learned skill where we have to expose or subject the athlete to heavier loads and moving them at a very slow pace to teach the GTOs that, hey, 400 pounds on a back squat isn't a bad position. You don't need to panic. We're going to be okay. And then once we get comfortable with that eccentric loading, it will be reflective in standard concentric loading. On the isometric side, I think I really look into the increasing the stretch of tendons, which can then maximize the stretch shortening cycle or the SSC. So again, we're getting down into the bottom of squat, going for a 5-second count at 75%. That is basically going to teach the muscles and the tendons, to be able to respond better to that without that tempo application. Just a little quick physiology here. Again, we mentioned the Golgi tendon organs and the muscle spindle fibers are really what we're looking at here. But if we look at, the spindles, we're looking at a response to stretch. So again, we have to get down into deep ranges of motion and then hold them so that we can kind of teach the body that this is an effective functional position for us to be in. With the Golgi tendon organ, this is when you're sitting at the doctor's office and they bang you with a little mallet on your knee. We're just looking at here the tension that's created in these deep level isometrics and eccentrics, and teaching those tendon organs to kind of relax or kind of step out of the way, so to speak. Moving on to positional work here. Positional work, let me start here with an example. Cycle squat is a good one to look at, but with the cycle squat, we're basically doing a multi-positional squat here where we're working all the way down into bottom range and then coming halfway up, back down, and then all the way back down. You notice here I'm also using some plates for heel elevation because my deep ranges of squat flexion suck, but again, just trying to teach the mechanics of different positions and how those can be effective. So when we look at the regression side, we're looking at partials, hand supported, or I even throw half kneeling into a regression side here. But partials are somebody who has they're coming off of a rotator cuff tear, and when we're trying to work bench, if they get to a certain range of motion, they get that sharp shooting pain, or they're incapable of moving into that range. So what we'll do is we'll just throw a block on the bench or like a board press and just work partial range of motion. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just where they are at that moment. It's not an end point. It's a step to get to the next point, which will then lead us to the end point. Hand supported is something I'm using a lot more of, and I think doesn't get enough appreciation. But we look at like a single leg RDL, and if you see that the athlete is fighting the balance or the stability component of it, just have them use a PVC pipe or put their hand on something to give an extra point of contact, and let them get the muscular effects of the exercise rather than trying to challenge the proprioceptive or the balance aspects, right? Dropping a hand down on a single leg RDL does not make it a cheat exercise or does not make it, an ineffective exercise. In fact, it just optimizes the muscular loading. Half kneeling, again, is one we're all pretty familiar with, but this is a way to control variables, so we're able to put them in a confined space so that they can emphasize what we're trying to get them to focus on. On the progressive side, I was really back and forth on split because I don't know if this is really a progression or really where we should start from, but nevertheless, if we're looking at it from a conventional model, this is a way to introduce frontal plane stability. We'll talk a little bit about a kickstand position too, but in my opinion, these are just a little bit more reflective of athletic movement, and I think that split position work is probably my marquee position to work from. Unilateral is definitely more of a progression side, but this starts to throw some transverse mechanics into the equation here. And then we see, again, I have partials on the progression side as well. This is a way that we can use, or this is something we can use with more advanced athletes that we can overload certain positions on. So, doing a quarter squat at 110% or doing a half rep bench at 105%, just to teach the body to understand what heavier loads feel like. Another position that I tend to work a lot from is using offset loading, and this is a way that I believe we can introduce new vectors to movement. So, a quick example of this being an offset bent row. But with all things considered, I think this is great for our fascial slings, great for our core, and great for transverse joint mechanics. By having a single load, we are changing how that hip needs to stabilize, and we're changing how the musculature on the posterior chain needs to fire in order to complete that movement. Kind of just tacking on to that a little bit, this might be a good slide for you guys to screenshot, but half kneel, tall kneel, these are ones that are more rudimentary in nature or more accessory in nature. We're obviously not going to be doing anything that's a foundational lift from a tall kneel or a half kneel position, but sprinkling these in as we need are definitely beneficial. And again, that half kneeling position, the big thing here is we're increasing contact stability. So we're adding a stability point in the front and the back of the athlete. So this allows us to get into a better position for the pelvis, and then we can kind of stack the upper body on top of that. So it really, kind of takes the variables down for the athlete. Bilateral split, I already kind of mentioned this, but I think that bilateral is something that needs to be earned. It is not the most basic position to work from, in my opinion. I think that we've been misguided on that. I would say to start most of your athletes that are having trouble with bilateral stuff in the split position, and then work your way into bilateral movement. What is the difference between a split squat and a back squat? Well, if you're a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter, you have to back squat. Outside of that population, not much. We do not need to have our athletes back squat or front squat for them to be strong in the lower chain or to be an effective athlete. We need to find the squat that works best for them. Kickstand. So this is something I'm starting to play a little bit more with, but I believe it's just a slightly more athletic split position. We're kind of closing the distance between the front and the back foot, and, for all intents and purposes, probably a little bit more narrow as well. But we still have the same exact concept going on. And I think for both, we are looking at, independent hip action, which is great, but we're also getting great effects at the foot, ankle, and lower leg. Single leg is, again, another one that's definitely more so on the progressive side, but I think that this is something that we want to try to get our athletes into as quickly as we can within reason, because there's just such tremendous benefit from single leg work, mostly the triplanar stability effect, and then also, again, down at the foot and the deep core activation. Last variable here we're looking at is accommodating resistance. So this is, when we think about accommodating resistance, most of us go right again to Louis and the guys and girls over at Westside. But if we look elsewhere for band or accommodating loading, where do we see it a lot? Well, we see a ton of this in rehab and early phase physical therapy and such. So being that my job is somewhat of a unique blend between the two, working with high performers that are inherently injured, I've tried to kind of meet in the middle on those two ends and seeing how we can apply bands and change for that matter too. And there's just so much to love about it. So I'll die on my sword, saying this, that bands are the most versatile piece of equipment in the gym. And yeah, I know, the body and the floor, whatever, but physical piece of equipment, it's pretty hard to beat the versatility of bands. I think this is what I really focus in on, and love about it, and that is it's optimizing tissue load while de-emphasizing joint load, and we'll talk on that in a second, but I think that's a really important one, and for those of you who work in the college sector, that's an important one, probably in season more than anything else. I also love the biofeedback factor with bands. It allows the athlete to really kind of dial in on finding their most organic path of motion or range of motion for things, and just allowing them to have a little bit more discretion in the movement strategy. But, we look here at the progressions and the regressions. And on the regression side, this is, again, there's a ton of value for bands on the regression side. It's not always just about adding them as resistance or adding them as a chaos effect, right? We can use this for biofeedback. We can see here with an RNT squat, which is a functional movement systems application here. But here I'm pulling Nicole's knee outward to help prevent her from going into a valgus collapse. So this again is a somewhat playing with the neurology effect, where we're getting the athlete to have that biofeedback of, hey, my knee is tipping in too far into valgus, and I need to maintain that knee over big toe pattern as I go into the squat. Similarly, we see here with an unloaded hinge, this is something that I utilize often early on, or for athletes that are, or I'm sorry, not a hinge, a squat, for athletes who are coming off of injury. So you see the purple band here across the J hooks. So we're still loading this, but what we're doing is when they get into those deeper ranges, let's say they're coming off of a meniscus tear, when they get into those deeper ranges of knee flexion, that band is going to help facilitate that pattern without putting them in pain or giving them a negative feedback response there. So this is an effective strategy. Of course, it's not a long-term solution, but this is something we can use to help facilitate ranges of motion. Kind of mentioned it a second ago, but band assist, band unload, those are phenomenal for young athletes, for novice athletes, or those coming off of injury. And again, we want to look at ways that we can feed them into loading at body weight or loading at minimal external weight, and instead of just starting them with holding a 20-pound dumbbell for goblet squats and waiting until the injury has permitted them to be able to go deeper into flexion, we can kind of accelerate that by using these band strategies. Band loading, again, that kind of speaks for itself. We're pretty well versed on that. Band chaos is something that I would say is definitely more reserved for the advanced athlete, but is something that, again, we can utilize, in small samples with just about everybody. Band offset loading, I think I'm one of few that, truly practices this with regularity, but I can't speak highly enough of this, and I think that, it's really great for optimizing core strength and for optimizing kinesthetic awareness or athlete consciousness of movement. Having a push up with a lateral band pull is going to create a unique stimulus for them and force them to be conscientious of how they're moving. Didn't talk too much on chains. It's not a huge application in my world. I think for most of you that are familiar with the West Side method know the applications of chains, but really this is just a way to linearly overload the end ranges of motion or the top range of motion. The one thing that I will add with chains is, for some reason, it tends to be really good for athletes who have tendonitis, arthritis, or kind of just nagging joint pain. The chains kind of help them to be able to navigate those ranges of motion or paths of motion a little bit more seamlessly. Real quick here, again, this is probably a good screenshot slide here, but nothing of what I'm mentioning is done just for the hell of it or just because. These are always logical steps that are applied for a specific reason. I think that with all things being equal, or with all things being said, tempos are just a great equalizer. So if you if you haven't read it yet, Cal's book, Cal Dietz, Triphasic Training, is really the absolute gold standard of tempo application, and really gets into some good detail on how and why these are so important. I mean, Triphasic Training was such a profound book for me, career-wise or professionally speaking, and it really just emphasized, the importance of looking at each phase of movement for itself independently rather than just, having them go through the motions on things. If we look here at, ways that we can implement some of these things, and this is speaking more so to the tempos, I believe. But we look at warm up, and there are certain things that we want to try to exonerate through the warm up and the movement prep period. And the first thing that comes to my mind is we have to challenge what we know is weak. And that can be an everyday thing, but looking at exaggerating movement speeds to try to get a stimulation effect from the central nervous system, and again, just exposing the athlete to a variety of stimulus, I think has benefits. And of course, for warm-up's sake, we want to direct and oppose the major movements for that day. In our primary work, so I'm somebody who doesn't mess with the 1A or the main lift for the day very much. So if I'm coming in and I have, bench or squat or dead or whatever, I'm going to do my sets on bench, squat, dead, clean, without much parameter. I'm just going to work those conventionally. But then I'll normally add in drop-down sets, or I'll use my secondary block to bring the intensity way down on, those main lifts, and then apply either, accommodating resistance or tempos or positional work, and then utilize them in that strategy. Accessory work is really where the magic happens. I don't do very many accessory movements with redundancy at all. If we have a bent row in week 1 with dumbbells, we're going to do it single arm the next week. We're going to do it with a chain load the next week. Then we're going to add a band. Then we're going to go back to doubles with kettlebells, and we're going to add a tempo to it. And I'm just always going to be playing with those. I just think that it's a very little return to just have somebody do a dumbbell RDL for 4 straight weeks. And bringing it all together here, so this being just a really quick cardboard cutout of what a sample program overlook might see. So we look at our different mesocycles here, strength, endurance, hypertrophy, muscular strength, our conventional applications here, our volume, our intensity, and then I'm just going to add our tempo cadence. So in week 1, we may work a 3-second combo. So what I mean by combo is we may do a 3-count eccentric into a 3-count isometric, or we may just work 3-second eccentric and then right out. And then come down here and maybe switch over to isometrics. Again, it's something that's going to be driven by the athlete based on what I see, but this is more of just an exposure period where I want them to understand and feel what these tempos are, but we're not really we're not really trying to do anything too specific with them. Same thing here with our accommodating load. So I'll throw some bands in, I'll throw some chains in, really just as exposure more than anything else. Once we get to the second mesocycle, so we're looking at weeks 4 through 6, in a hypertrophy phase, we're working our conventional parameters. Now for hypertrophy, I'm going to apply exclusively eccentric overload or eccentric emphasis, right? So a 3-second, 4-second, 5-second progression, that being week 4, week 5, week 6. And we are going to challenge that eccentric loading. For that, I'll probably add some band weight on there. So again, we're looking at that drop down set or that secondary block for our primary lifts. And we'll use about 25 to 45% of the total load through band tension. Coming down here to the bottom, this final phase, we're looking at muscular strength. So we're working our conventional parameters here, and now we're going to shift into an isometric focus. So I may lay out our second block the exact same from week 4 to week 9. But what's going to change is the amount of weight that we're doing, the reps that we're doing, and then the tempos that we're using and the accommodating load that we're using. So if we take let's just say a barbell front squat and a barbell RDL for our block 2. If we work block 1 at 75, our block 2 is going to be down at 55%, 60%, and 65%. And we're going to be doing sets of 5, 4s, and 3s. And we will work those with a 3-second eccentric, 4-second eccentric, 5-second eccentric in weeks 4, 5, 6 respectively. I'll keep those same exact exercise down in the fold, adjust the parameters, and then we're going to go through it again, but with a 3, 4, and 5-second isometric. And again, where in week 4 through 6, we're applying some bands to that. In week 7 through 9, we're applying some chains to that. So the exercise selection is very, very, very low on the priority totem pole for me. I'm looking at these different parameters that I can kind of utilize to get something different out of the same thing. And to finish off here, we look into, again, at the warm-up protocols, and we're looking at, how we can filter in these tempos and these different positional things. Well, one of the best ones I've ever been introduced to is the spring ankle series, which, again, I have to give credit to Cal Dietz on. But we're working largely isometric action, but it's heavily based on position. So we're looking at, a top-end position, a middle position, and a low-end position, just on the ankle. Tempo lunge pretty much speaks for itself, but there's not anything real specific on there, right? We may do it at 1 week where we're doing an isometric emphasis, pausing in the bottom of the lunge. The week after, we may do it with an eccentric, and then the week after, we may do a pulsing or a reactive lunge, right? So again, it should be reflective of what our training parameters are, but sometimes it's okay to just apply some different things in our warm-up period just for the sake of it. Hand release push-up, just an isometric-based push-up. And then we see our breathing implements here. So, adding in a single arm hypoxic march, or, giving specific parameters on a bike or any piece of cardio. So instead of just saying, hey, let's just go get on a bike for 3 to 5 minutes, I'm going to have my athletes, hey, let's get on a bike at 65 RPM. We'll go about 5 minutes, and I only want you to breathe through the nose. So again, it's just kind of providing some value to some of these things. And, single leg glute iso, again, just getting into a specific position and applying a isometric tempo to it. So, all 6? So all 6 of these, I may break these up by 2s, work these 2 for the first couple weeks, work these 2 for the next couple of weeks, and then work these 2 for the next couple of weeks. There's no real rhyme or reason to it, but, these just being a couple of examples to help paint the point. So that's about it for what I have for you. Hopefully that was effective and valuable for you. But I think, again, really the most important point to look at is really just looking at your programming, looking at what your athletes are training for, where they're at in terms of training ability and training history, and just looking to really, really create some density and saturate your training as best you can to provide these layers and these intermediate progression steps to just kind of create a more robust and durable athlete. Anybody who may have any questions on any of this stuff, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always available to talk shop, and you can reach me on social media at danmode_VHP.